I'm Joyce, and I'm the Executive Director of Survivors of Suicide Loss here in San Diego. So with the walk, we are so intentional about wanting people to find hope and healing. And we understand not everybody's going to find the courage or the will to come to a support group. But if we can get them to come to that walk that day, it's one opportunity for them to stand in community with almost 1,000 other people who've lived what they've lived through, and to get some resources and to find some hope. And it's in taking that step for the first time that can be the beginning of a journey of healing for many people. So we encourage everybody to come out on November 11th to the Walk in Remembrance of Hope. And what we say is, together, one step at a time, we can find hope. Hope is just one step away. And the first thing we always try to let them know is what you're having is a very normal reaction to a very abnormal situation, because the emotions are all over the place. And so you are going to have to learn to be gracious and gentle with yourself, because it is hard. And this is going to be the hardest thing I hope that you ever have to go through in your life. I hope you never have to go through anything like this again. But the important thing is to get plugged into some kind of support. What that support looks like for you may not be what it looked like for me, but there are many, many ways that you can reach support. If you can find a mental health professional who understands trauma and grief, not just any mental health professional, they have to understand how grief and trauma interact together, and or if they have experience in suicide grief, that is good. Coming to a group like Survivors of Suicide Loss. If you have a hard time getting to a group, call us. We'll try to get someone that can help you walk in that first time. Also tell people, try the group at least 3 times, because the first time it's just such a new experience, we aren't quite sure. But try it for at least 3 times, or try one of our different groups, maybe a different location, a different blending of personalities. But the important thing is you have to find a place to be able to talk about this. You may have very supportive family and friends, and you're going to have to identify very quickly, are these people able to support me? And if they're not, you may have to just accept the fact that some people who you thought might be able to be there for you aren't, and gravitate towards the ones who you do find are able to be there for you, because not everybody can walk along in the grief, and it's an unfortunate part, I think, of suicide loss. Find out everything you can about what you can do to help yourself. We have a number of resources. Reach out to our warm line. If you have questions, if you have children, you know, how can you support those children? But just really begin to be active in your own recovery process, because it's vital. It doesn't just happen. The recovery is not going to just happen unless you invest in it. And so you have to be active, and you have to be consistent, and you have to be gracious to yourself. It's a lot, but. So I became the Executive Director of Survivors of Suicide Loss just 3 years ago. So I actually never used the services to heal from a suicide. The first thing I wanted to do was work in mental health advocacy, and especially within the faith communities who are so ignorant about mental health issues. And so that was where I first dove into. I used my family, friends, my mental health professional to work through the suicide loss. But my story is a little bit unique, and what drew me to even decide to accept the position of Executive Director for Survivors of Suicide Loss is my husband's story. Because my husband lost his father to suicide when he was 16. And in society at that time, you didn't get to talk about suicide, mental illness, and so it became the family secret. And so that trauma that was buried deep inside of him was the root of his own clinical depression that resurfaced many years later. So as I was considering this position and what SOSL does, I mean, the light bulb just went on in my head that said, if there had been survivors of suicide loss for Ken and his family, I might not be standing where I am today. And so that's my passion, because I have lived in the aftermath of seeing what happens when people don't have the opportunity to heal after suicide. And so I believe SOSL gives people that opportunity to work through that, and greatly eliminates, either greatly reduces or eliminates that higher risk of suicide in the survivor community. So that's vital to me. So that's really kind of how it came full circle for me. And what has been interesting is, because again, I told you I had wonderful family and friends. They would listen, but every so often I would share something with them, and they would just kind of look at me or try to help me, like, well, can't you just think about it differently? And I'd get stuck because they just couldn't really relate on some things I was struggling with. And after I stepped into this role and started attending some of the support groups, and I'd hear other survivors vocalize some of those things that I was getting stuck on, I would just tick it off and I go, aha, it's a survivor thing. And so I do know that there's great healing in being around other people who you don't have to explain all of those things that you're processing and trying to get through and you're churning with, that as much as people love you and empathize with you, if they haven't experienced that kind of loss, they just can't quite click in to some of those challenges. So that's what I think survivors of suicide loss does for those who are left behind. It gives you an opportunity to process, gives you an opportunity to heal, and you don't have to explain all of the emotions that are all over the map, because people get them because they're walking through them too. I think the first few months for everybody is just, your world is shattered. Like everything is just torn apart. It's even moving through daily activities takes such an inordinate amount of energy. And what's interesting is I knew that my husband was suicidal. He had been suicidal for 6 years. So the suicide was not a quote-unquote surprise to me, and I was still overwhelmed with the pain. Literally, I don't know if people can relate to this, but having that physical broken heart where you almost feel doubled over in pain. I remember sometimes just even walking down the hall and having to hold on to the wall just to be able to get down that wall. It just shatters you. It just tears you apart. It just renders you helpless and overwhelmed. I think that's consistent whether you are blindsided by the suicide or even if you have the anticipation ahead of time. There's nothing that can ever prepare you for walking through a loss by suicide. Support, community. I did not find survivors of suicide loss, but I was very fortunate to have been working with a mental health professional because Ken had been ill for 12 years, so I was getting support from a mental health professional, and then I just had amazing family and friends in church that were able to let me talk and process and just be there. And so I think every survivor has to find some sort of community and connection, because that is what keeps us standing and keeping moving forward.